I'm now going to say something that will astonish you.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
Ein Niemals!
I have a dream.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
We are living in an increasingly polarized world.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration.
We must begin now.
Welcome to the Bulletin podcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new season of the Bulletin podcast. This is your producer, Hussein Al-Mallah, and here's what's coming up.
After all, there is a vast literature that investigates private standards as a phenomenon that exists for some decades now. Is that the law focuses on companies, on operations, and direct contractual partners. This means that the supply chain laws, they are no silver bullet.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Bulletin's podcast. My name is Jesus Renzulo, and I'm with
Clara. Hi everyone.
So, Clara, what have you? It's been a while since we were online. We've been in vacations, and we barely came back last month. So, what have you been doing?
Yeah, yesterday I just go to shoppings and stock up my things, and I'm really surprised to see so many climate neutrals and cruelty-free and fair trade products, and I buy lots of fair trade chocolate.
Yeah, that's something that is really good about Europe in general. The developed nations are really putting their stakes up regarding climate neutrality, high standards for consumption and production, and that's something that we've seen in the EU Green Deal, in the new Green Deal, and even in the new German law of supply chain law that has been released not long ago. People are really, our states are really taking seriously this thing of decarbonizing and making products high quality.
Yeah, and not just green, but also on the human rights aspects, and it really make you as a consumer you feel better and less worry when you go shoppings and yeah.
Yeah, but one thing that I always think about when we see all these laws, because they look really well in paper, of course, they look fantastic. But my question is, yeah, how does this affect both people and enterprises in Germany and people and enterprises abroad? Because many countries depend on exporting to the EU or exporting to the US to stay, like to make money and to increase their output and their products. So I was wondering how this new German supply law would affect developing nations.
Yes, and today we have the perfect person to speak on the topics. Let's welcome Karina Marzano. Karina Marzano is our PhD candidate at the Willy Brandt Schools of Public Policy. Yay! She is also Associate Fellows at the Institutions for Advanced Sustainability Study, IASS, in the Potsdam, Germany. She has law and MBA backgrounds, and her research lies in the sections between climate and trade, which is our topic today. Her PhD project centers on private environmental governance and the global south. Today, she was from this perspective to share her insights on the law.
Oh, that's perfect. Then let's not waste any more time and let's see what she has to say.
Yay!
So, welcome, Karina. Thank you so much for being here with us at the Willy Brandt Bulletin podcast. I know you have a busy time, but even so, you make a little space for us. Thank you so much.
So hello, Clara and Jesus. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you.
So, let's start with the first question. Clara?
Yeah, we're so glad to have Karina today, our PhD candidate of Willy Brandt School with us, and she has been researching on private environment and governments and the global south under the supervision of Professor Andreas Goldthau. So we're glad to have read your latest articles from on Brandt website. which is about the newly passed global supply chains law in Germany. Would you please explain to us what is the goal of the law and why is it so important?
Sure. So let's start with the first thing one must keep in mind to understand the German Supply Chain Act. This law is based on the idea that in a globalized world, not only goods, but also rules can travel the globe. And the goal is to protect consumers, workers, and suppliers. This idea is not completely new. In fact, since the 90s, private standards have governed supply chains and proliferated. And it happened because activists recognized that structures established by lead firms to manage their supply chains could also be leveraged to compensate for states' inability to regulate or enforce environmental and social rights. The difference now is that mandatory public regulations are emerging. And because of that, some have called the German Supply Chain Act a paradigm shift. But the German Act is not exactly the first one of its kind. There are other similar examples in the Netherlands and France, in UK, but also at the EU level, such as timber and conflict minerals regulation. But the German law is still among these pioneer initiatives. This gives Germany and German companies the advantages of first movers. As I was following the discussions here in Germany, I had this idea to write an article to analyze the German law. But precisely because few examples of these kinds of due diligence laws exist, there are not many comprehensive studies assessing their impacts. So I thought I could assess the law based on lessons learned from the private governance literature, as you mentioned, which is my PhD topic. After all, there is a vast literature that investigates private standards as a phenomenon that exists for some decades now. But what does the German law say? First, this law will come into effect in 2023, and then it will be expanded in 2024. And it will apply to German companies, but also foreign companies that have a branch office in Germany. And it will start with companies with 3,000 employees or more, and then it will apply also to companies with 1,000 employees or more. And the law requires these companies to exercise care by ensuring compliance with some human rights and environmental standards. And one of the strongest aspects of the law is that it requires companies to set up process to identify, assess, prevent human rights and environmental risks, but also to remedy impacts and report the measures the companies have in place to address these problems. And companies that violate due diligence obligations, they can be fined. And an important final aspect is that trade unions and NGOs based in Germany, they may go to court on behalf of victims of human rights abuses and environmental harm.
So it's a little like the Kimberley process, but expanded and developed.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So this is basically the law as a whole, which, as you said, is a big development in what is international trade law and corporate responsibility in an international level. But there's also, as good as it sounds, there's also some things that might worry some people. So we understand that there's controversy of the law. There are many opinions of whether this is good or bad for both Germany and developing countries. So what are the main flaws of the laws, in your opinion?
Yeah, of course, no law is perfect. And there are many aspects that need to be considered by this type of legislation. And I would like to call attention first to two main weaknesses of the German law. Let's put it this way. The first one is that the law focuses on companies, on operations, and direct contractual partners. This is also known as Tier 1 in supply chains. Its most comprehensive obligations do not apply to indirect suppliers. But it's precisely further upstream in supply chains at the beginning where abuses are most likely to happen. And regarding these indirect suppliers, the law only states that companies need to support them in risk prevention and avoidance. The second weak spot is that regarding the content of the risks that are covered. The law focuses mostly on human rights. So it includes risks such as forced and child labor, discrimination, unequal treatment, particularly unequal payment, freedom of association, and occupational health and safety. When it comes to environmental risks, the law only covers a few obligations. Still connected to human rights, the law prohibits causing harmful soil change, water and air pollution, or excessive water consumption. It also bans unlawful eviction or deprivation of land, forests, and water, which could indirectly protect indigenous rights, for example, although they are not exactly mentioned in the law. But in the specific part of the legislation that talks about environmental risks, the law regulates obligations that arise from three international conventions. These conventions are the Minamata Convention on Mercury, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and their disposal. This means that the improper use of pesticides, for example, is covered by the law, but actions regarding climate change and biodiversity loss, they are not covered by the law.
They are not, so they are bigger, but they are not comprehensive enough. And that's understandable to some extent because laws cannot cover everything. And in some extent, statistical and accountability measures in many countries are not that strong.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
uh,
as our school is on more developments, and many of the students are from global south. So we would like to know what are the impact of this law to global south.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, with this law, German can, let's put, export social and environmental regulations that travel through supply chains, thus also influence what happens abroad. This means that there is an expectation that the law will not only improve the situation of workers and consumers in Germany, but also of suppliers elsewhere. But there are some concerns. In a recent article, Professor Goldthau here of the Willy Brandt School, he warns us about the geoeconomics and political implications of European Union climate and energy strategies, particularly regarding the consequence for the developing world. And I believe a similar argument can be made for the German Supply Chain Act. And one of the main concerns is that German corporations, they will simply withdraw from supply chains in developing countries. This is a strategy known as cut and run. It is important to say that the German Act applies the principle of empowerment before withdrawal, which encourages these companies to seek solutions with suppliers or within the industry first, and the termination of business relationships should be a last resort. However, instead of going the apparently complicated way of implementing the new rules, companies could simply rely on other OECD trading partners in the future. German companies could avoid have business with partners from countries known for their social and environmental problems. If this happens, people in developing countries will suffer even more as a result. Affected countries would have less access to expertise, technology, and that would have negative effects on employment, economic growth, and sustainability. We must also bear in mind that we face a reality of unequal supply chains, in the sense that profits, they are concentrated in the hands of big companies in wealthy countries, and many social and environmental problems arise in this context. As profits are concentrated in the hands of a few large and powerful firms, suppliers are often pressured to decrease their costs. And in extreme scenarios, this could lead to child labor, to slavery, and environmental harm. Therefore, we need to find ways to combat the root causes of poverty that often drives deforestation and inadequate labor conditions. But having said that, there are still some open questions on how the monitoring of the law will take place and who is going to pay for it. So going back to the literature again, there are some works that warns us that sustainability-driven demands, such as in the case of the German supply chain law, could worsen the reality of these unequal supply chains. There is work from Stefano Ponte, for example. This is because costs, such as the costs of tracing and certifying production, they are often pushed to suppliers at the beginning of the supply chain. And smallholders, suppliers, they could be hit even harder when costs are passed on to them, but they lack financial resources and cannot count on public infrastructure or investment. And although the German Act recognizes that the prices for some goods and services may increase because of compliance with the law, these costs have not been quantified, which is, of course, something really hard to do. And the law does not call for a more equal distribution of costs among buyers and suppliers.
Of course, it is hard and I think almost impossible to determine a global general cost of how much this is going to do. Many countries do not have the infrastructure or accountability capacity to do this, and build it is a cost in itself. And that's super interesting that we talk about how is this affecting the global south, because there's a lot to be said about developed countries like Germany creating standards, like creating global standards. But there's also a lot to be said of how much does really the South, the global South has the capacity to be accountable for those global standards. I would like to, because there are many examples of these things, like the mining companies in Venezuela or the problem of the palm oil in Africa. But could you give us a more concrete example? I have heard this big trouble that has been caused, especially since the arrival of Bolsonaro, of the situation of human rights in Brazil and environmental deforestation. Could you tell us a little more about that and how the law would play a role there?
Sure. So let's have an illustrative example with the case of Brazil. Brazil does not have a supply chain law, but it has, of course, a complex of national labor and environmental laws, and it has ratified many international treaties, including the 3 environmental conventions that the German law regulates. And there are some positive expectations, for example, that the German law will strengthen Brazilian labor unions. And while it seems clear that the German companies that allow child labor or use pesticides improperly in Brazil could be fined in the future according to the law, there are some other aspects that are still unclear. Let me bring some context before. Despite its economic size, Brazil participates in the International Division of Labor mainly as a supplier of raw materials and agro-commodities, for example. And there are social and environmental challenges related to commodity production in Brazil, such as child labor, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and disrespect for the rights of indigenous peoples. So this scenario has been calling national and international attention to how commodities are produced in the country. And although child labor associated to Brazilian agro-commodities production could be covered by the German law, it is not clear whether the law, because of its limited environmental scope, affects companies that contribute to deforestation in the Amazon region. Besides, as I mentioned, the law does not address greenhouse gas emissions associated with meat production, for example, or biodiversity loss caused by soy monocultures. But there is right now a bunch of new legislative proposals being discussed, and they could affect the Brazilian agriculture sector, so we need to keep an eye on them. This includes an European Union law for deforestation-free supply chains and a law in the US on forest, it's called the Forest Act. And if these proposals, they become laws, they could affect Brazilian soy and beef production in areas such as the Amazon rainforest, but also grasslands such as Cerrado biome and wetlands like Pantanal. But since they are proposals, there are still some open questions. For example, will these laws cover only illegal or also legal deforestation? And will they mix voluntary and mandatory rules? And will they resist potential complaints about trade protectionism at the WTO? And there is also another important aspect to have in mind when we think about the example of Brazil, which is the fact that Brazilian trade relations, they have been moving east for a while. In 2009, China surpassed the United States as Brazil's main trade partner. And much of this change is explained by growing Asian demand for Brazilian commodities. This shift in end markets over the last years, they can reduce the expected effects of laws in the European Union and the US that this can reduce the effects these laws could have on the Brazilian agriculture sector. And not by coincidence, NGOs are also shifting their attention to China. There is an example of an NGO called Solidaridad, who just developed the China Sustainable Soy Guideline. In this guideline, it aims to seek the buy-in from Chinese multinationals, especially those with operations in South America, for example.
Interesting. There are so many things to take into account.
Yes. It's like a struggles because, as you have mentioned it earlier, we are like many activists is like looking forward to this law, and it's like a victory, and we are long awaiting this law because it's serve kind of justice. But when we look into it, there can be so many challenge. Like if we cut and run, as you mentioned it earlier, it may hurt the livelihood even more. So how when we are feeling good to see this law, but how do we balance the impact? And as a policy advisor, what would you suggest on that?
Yes, so as I mentioned, no law is perfect, and it is expected that complex issues, such as those involved in sustainable production and consumption practices, demand complex solutions. This means that the supply chain laws, they are no silver bullet, but they are certainly an important piece of the puzzle. My initial policy recommendations would be to expand the obligations to indirect suppliers and to adopt a more comprehensive framework that covers biodiversity loss and climate change. And European Union due diligence law is expected for next year. So we need to follow to see its progress and to see whether an European law will be more comprehensive than the German one. But I also would like to highlight the need for international cooperation to complement these due diligence laws. And these suggestions, they are made in the background of our discussion about this unequal international economic system. So we need more collaborative actions between governments. And this could happen, for example, through mechanisms such as low carbon technology transfers. But we also need more collaborative actions between private actors. There is interesting work by Richard Locke in which he argues in favor of rethinking this traditional compliance model, in his case for private standards, but also applied to supply chain laws. He says that in addition to suppliers being rewarded or punished for their performance, there is a need of commitment-based approaches. His study shows, for example, the improvement of labor conditions in supply chains. They depend on buyers investing in long-term, mutually beneficial relations with suppliers, which could include capacity building, but also interesting business model innovations such as fair trade and profit sharing. And these collaborative actions must complement supply chain laws. But since I give the example of Brazil, I just want to finish with a final note. Although more international cooperation in human rights and environmental issues are sorely needed, the Brazilian government also needs to bring its human rights and climate change politics back on track. And this is only possible by protecting indigenous rights and attacking deforestation head on. After all, Brazil is one of the few countries with most of its greenhouse gas emissions not associated with the energy sector, but is precisely with agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And although the fight against climate change is a global fight, Brazil must do its homework. This could be done, for example, by strengthening oversight bodies to enforce Brazilian labor and environmental regulations. And this could also be done by introducing a Brazilian supply chain law, one that is comprehensive and ambitious enough to cover the broad range of human rights and environmental risks that we discussed in this podcast.
I completely agree with you, and it's amazing to see all that. As a person from Latin America, I think that it's more than necessary, and coming from a neighboring country that is Venezuela, it's completely necessary that Brazil, Venezuela, and even many other countries like Argentina need to put their things straight regarding environmental protection. Thank you so much, Karina, for this interview, for your time, and for your magnificent insights. And
Thank you.
we hope to see more of your work soon and to keep talking to you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and congratulations on both of you for organizing these important discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So, this has been another Bulletin podcast. It's been a great talk. What do you think about it, Clara?
Yeah, I really like it because her sharing is so comprehensive, and she also brings in a perspective that's often neglected in mass media.
I completely agree. Ms. Marzano has made a great presentation, and in fact, the idea of analyzing the global supply chain law from an external perspective, how it will affect developing countries and emerging economies, it's something that needs to be talked about. But sadly, we need to end this podcast episode now, but not without making some announcements. To start, we want to say that in the Willy Brandt School, we're gonna hold elections. So, if you want to vote, if you're from the Willy Brandt School and want to vote for your new president, vice president, and student representatives, don't forget to do it.
Yeah, and we also would like to welcome the new Bulletin podcast member. I can feel the energy already. They are really going to be making good contributions. And don't forget to follow Willy Brown School on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn account.
Yes, so you can keep seeing not only our bulletin podcast every month, but also the bulletins, articles, live on brand school, and new announcements. So, with no more to say, till the next time. Bye bye.
Bye bye.